Hey everyone, today's video is going to be how to draw elves. So this isn't like the official way to draw elves or the right way. But this is just kind of some things I like to draw for elves and different features and sort of ideas. And it's kind of one of my favorite things to draw. I usually would rather prefer to draw an elf like rather than a human, but they're really not that much different. I already know there's gonna be a lot of people in the comments that are like, "Oh, how to draw elves? First you have to learn all of the human anatomy first." And honestly, you really don't, because everyone can kind of draw their own. Everyone can try to draw a character in some way. It might not be like to your standard, or you might not think it's like a good character, but everyone can sort of draw a character. Even if you can only draw a stick figure, maybe, well, actually, we'll start with that. But even if you can only draw a stick figure and a smiley face, um, you could always start with your stick figure and basically keep adding on and doing iterations. But from your first stick figure, and you want to draw an elf, well, elves have pointy ears. And so there you go. You got an elf drawn. And then if you wanted to go a little bit further, maybe the elf has a little goatee. Usually elves seem not to have too much facial hair. But one of the things that I think is pretty characteristic of an elf is a little bit of a feminine sort of side. Since they have a bit of like elegance or very one with nature, those sorts of things. So we can add a bit of that to it. And so one thing is we could do longer hair. And we could do maybe a darker goatee to add a bit of contrast between the hair. And my brush is very doesn't want to work with me today. And then elves also have pretty nice eyebrows. And I mean, this is kind of just all my personal preference of drawing elves too. So there's definitely a lot of freedom, and you can do whatever you can think of and imagine with your own elves. Like literally just go crazy with as crazy as you want with your characters. But yeah, so from doing a stick figure, even if you can't draw very well, you can sort of just add on whatever features you know about an elf. And that's kind of how I suggest going about anything, is just start in with anything that you can think of or know about the subject. So from the elves, I really like doing very detailed medieval armor on an elf. So let's add a bit of a chest piece. And I'll make it kind of large since I want to add a lot of carvings and things like that. So I like to do a lot of basically a design. And usually I would just kind of go with the flow and start doing lines that are crossing or covering across the armor like this. And we started with those lines going through, so could use that a bit to our benefit here and kind of use that for the end design. All right, so we got a chess piece, and we can also have our elf with a bow. And kind of just starting to play around with a bit of ideas. I think I want the bow to be on the side that he doesn't have a shoulder armor, so it'd be a little bit easier for him to aim. And from here, I will try to make this pose a little bit interesting. So from here, we'll go out with the arm and across the body. And this sort of like mark that we have here, I'll make into a wrap-in. And then we'll have him holding the bow. And then the bow, I will sort of just go outward far enough. And maybe it's a pretty long bow that has a couple different turns to it. Someone asked about brush pens the other day, and they said that it gets very flayed out, and sort of how to fix that. And I don't really have a way to fix it other than add in water or ink to it. But I'll oftentimes just draw with it and kind of go with it, since there's not many like foolproof solutions that I found to it, and it'll just sort of take a bit of time to kind of correct it. So I'll just sort of let it correct itself when it happens. But yeah, so we got our character, and now he's holding a bow, and he's got a bit of armor on him. And then this other arm is maybe holding the arrows. So I kind of like just basically what I said in the beginning. I started with a stick figure, and now I am adding anything that I can possibly think a elf would have, and kind of my own interests also added onto here. All right, and you can literally do this however you like. You can go and look up reference of elf and get some ideas of what you want to do, or you could just try to go from imagination and do what I'm doing and just kind of learn from the experience itself. It's really up to you and kind of your own way that you go about doing it. And so now we got a bit of armor going on. All right, so we got an elf, and we started with a stick figure. A little bit cartoony, but there's nothing wrong with cartoony. I think it's actually the most fun drawing cartoony sometimes. All right, and then I'll do a couple more different sort of iterations. So we have this elf over here, and this is kind of how I go about practicing anything. And then, so let's say I want to add a bit of more detail to his eyes. Since he's pretty far back, we can't see much of it. So we can go and do a little bit of a closer character here. And let's do more thin or straighter eyebrows. And then from here, we'll get some of the head shaped out. The one thing that I do really like about elves is it's kind of a nice way to practice females as well, since a lot of the female features are also on a lot of the male elves. So it's a really good transition, I think, if you are used to mostly drawing males and you kind of want to transition a bit. It can kind of be a bit of a middle ground, I feel like. And I always like doing topics like that, especially zombies. I like to do for when I'm practicing anatomy, since it's sort of a nice way to still be drawing what I want and to draw like full characters and scenes without sort of like super going hyper focused into the topic. And it's kind of makes anatomy a little more fun. And same with elves, they're a good way to practice a bunch of different things. And I think that I like to use them to practice faces as well, since I kind of find the pointy ears to be a little bit easier and forgiven to draw than a more normal, realistic ears. And that's kind of a interesting topic too. Is a lot of times when I want to practice something, I actually find doing a little bit of an off category. So like if I wanted to practice humans, drawing something like an orc or a goblin or maybe like a creature can really be a good way to practice faces in a more forgiving way, since you won't need to be very accurate and your mistakes won't be as less forgiven, really. And so I want to do a bit of a pointy chin and the pointy ears. And then we can go for a very kind of ornamental and very sharp features will sort of add to the elf a bit more. So I think really elves as a sort of an idea are very sharp, very nature orientated, and so doing a lot of things that are also sharp in maybe adding some materials that would be from nature will kind of add to that. And then even with the hair strands coming off, I'll make those a bit of a tapered end to kind of give a little bit more sharpness, especially since this tied bun in the back is not very sharp. And we could also fix that by adding a bit of a sharp object on top, or a pointed. But yeah, just kind of another iteration of the first character, basically, and then going a bit further and starting to add these. So I could play a lot around with this idea of the sharp features and kind of use that as like a bit of a way to explore off of. So using that idea for the shoulder pads and I could add spikes, but that might look a little bit more like an orc. So I'll save that for that. But I like to kind of just add as much detail as I can on the elves to just make it look a little bit kind of more like a Lord of the Rings style elf, which I find to be very pleasing, or at least one of my kind of favorite iterations of that. Or a lot of Dungeons and Dragons have some really good elf sort of characters. All right, and then I could kind of just continue and get this sort of armor just as kind of very gothic or gaudy, I guess, for as much like detail as I can get. And I just kind of like that as like a personal preference for doing elves. And then another thing is usually the elves are pretty skinny versus like a lot of goblins or other creatures in fantasy sort of things. And you could also do like a cape or something like that. But yeah, it's really endless what you could do with an elf. And really, as long as I think you have pointy ears on your character, it will kind of just look like an elf. All right. And then lastly, I'll do a female character before I do a quick time lapse finishing out these characters. I'll maybe do a couple more iterations as well to sort of just show a little more examples. But my brush is not liking me today, but so kind of just sort of doing that more elegant look, but I kind of like to do a little bit of like a fierce sort of nature, maybe a little more like animal kind of vibe to the characters as well. And I always like doing female elves a bit more than males, as I just kind of I like experimenting a lot with different features on a female, and I feel like the elf ears and kind of like that concept of the armor, I always like just how it looks. I guess very straight hair is probably also like that very Lord of the Rings sort of elf, now that I think about it. And we will go pretty deep. Try to go as pointy as I can on the chin there. But yeah, you can really do anything you want with pretty much any topic. Especially I like to do a lot of topics that have a lot of creative freedom and a lot of like iteration or a lot of room for creativity. That's why I like a lot of samurai and a lot of the other topics like zombies, as they sort of give a lot of options open for what you can do with their armor and like the patterns and different things like that. All right. So yeah, a lot of very sharp features, the pointy ears, and I think very detailed armor are kind of some of the key things that I look out for. And I like to do a lot of bows instead of kind of medieval weapons with them. But yeah, there's really you can do whatever you want with elves. Just kind of like I guess some examples from how I'd go about doing that. So yeah, I'll time lapse and get these all finished up for you. All right, that's gonna do it for the time lapse. So I just finished coloring everything and rendered it up with some ink wash and going over with some tonal with the markers. And yeah, I think it turned out pretty good. I experimented a lot with like the leafy, more nature aspects of elves with this one. And he started off turning a little bit like a goblin, especially when I colored his skin green. But he kind of slowly started to be more elf-like once I had the rest of his theme kind of more orchestrated towards it, more elvy with like the rest of the color. And then yeah, she kind of turned out pretty well, sort of more of like a fiery elf, I guess. And I really like having the pink and the green, red and green kind of right next to each other, and I think this really turned out nice for like the color combo. And then more of like a more frosty, maybe snow elves or some sort of thing like that. So I really wanted to play with like the skin tones and sort of like match with maybe like a biome or area that they're from. And yeah, and then kind of keeping their armor a bit more like earthy or wooden and that sort of thing. And then I really like how the sword color is like a very dark purple, more of like a maybe like a dark elf or something like that. Yeah, so that's gonna do it for the elf video. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I have something in my eye right now, but yeah, so we'll see you guys in this one.